Start with this happy note. As you know, on behalf of my colleagues here at the Beirut Urban Lab, I'm really very happy to welcome you all in these difficult times in Beirut, when both electricity and internet have become a luxury. It is wonderful to see the turnout and to see many colleagues still interested in discussing Beirut, Lebanon, the absurdity of the overlapping conflicts that we live, and ways, innovative ways in which we can really grapple with these conflicts. So I'll start with the fact that we're recording this session. We hope you don't mind, but many buildings have that have electricity generation turn off the generator from 5 to 7 p.m. to give it a rest before the night. So I have multiple requests on my phone to record and put online the session so people can hear you. Of course, I want to first start by really thanking Mohamad for first the fantastic book that he's put, really an inspiring, thought-provoking narration of Beirut's conflicts, but really in soft, disruptive ways that we absolutely need right now, as all the classical methods of political negotiation, organizing, and telling the story have failed us. I think that there's a unique input that comes from the work that he's put together. For those of you who don't know Mohamad, he is an artist. Mohamad Hafeda is an artist, a writer, and an academic based in London and Beirut. His work employs art and architecture practices as research methods to negotiate the politics of urban space. He focuses on issues of border, refuge, displacement, representation, and spatial rights. His longer biography was included in the announcement. It's also available on the website of the Beirut Urban Lab. So for those of you who want to check it. On a personal note, I met Mohamad maybe some 20 years ago, when he used to come and squat our classes at the American University because he hated his courses in the Lebanese University. He always had the best questions, the best comments. And so that conversation started a long time ago. His unique eye to see and make sense of things that we've become accustomed to and don't see have been inspiring to me for a long time. So Mohamad's going to start by presenting his book. I'll do the introduction immediately. We are really privileged to have three discussants this afternoon to discuss the book. Professor Sara Fregonese is a lecturer in political geography at the University of Birmingham. Her own research on geopolitics, security, and urban space, particularly on Beirut, has provided numerous insights for those of us also asking these questions. Her recent book, War and the City, Urban Geopolitics in Lebanon, has won numerous awards. Again, her biography is on the BUL website. She will be followed by Tania El Khoury. Tania, I'm sure you must have seen her perform at some point, and if you haven't, you've lost tons and you have to find a way to do it. Tania is a live artist whose work focuses on audience interactivity. She's concerned with the ethical and political potential of the encounter. She's created installations and performances in which the audience is an active collaborator. Her work has been translated and shown in over 30 countries in all 6 continents. Again, I strongly invite you to check out her biography, but also really her work. And last but not least, Ghenwa, who's joining us from Chicago, is Associate Professor of Modern Arabic Literature in the Department of Near East. Her book, Beirut, Imagining the City, Space and Place in Lebanese Literature, is more than a must read. If you love Lebanese literature, particularly the excellent one, she'll make you see it in a different way. So we're really privileged to have all three of you. I'm really glad that you're able to join us. We're going to start with Mohammed's presentation for about 20 minutes, and then we'll follow with the responses. Thank you everyone again for attending, and Mohammed, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mona, so much for your kind introduction and for hosting me today and for endorsing the book, as you said. And thank you to the Beirut Urban Lab team for organizing, and Ahmed for designing the event poster. So this event was supposed to take place at the end of 2019, and we were in conversation back then, and was postponed due to the series of events the country has undergone, and topped by global pandemic, which made our online meeting today a possibility. So kind of a positive thing. I'm so honored to have three amazing scholars and creative people, Sara, Ghenwa, and Tania. Thank you so much. And to being kind of engaged with my book. And I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say. And I would like to send my love and warmest solidarity to people in Lebanon, my friends, my family, whom I've been away from for almost 2 years, and to acknowledge really the immense difficulties they continue to experience. Thank you all also for attending today. So the project wouldn't have been possible without the support and funding of a number of institutions. I'll be very fast, to whom I wish to register my gratitude. Thank you to the Brontal Scholarship. Thank you to the Bartlett Urban Lab at UCL, the Arab Fund for Art and Culture, Heinrich Böll Foundation, and to Beirut Art Center for supporting the project. Thank you to Marwan Kaboul for designing the book interior. Thank you to my family, mother and sisters, 3 of them might be here today. And special thank you to the participants of this research project who remain anonymous. So I'll share my screen, and I hope everything works well. Can you see the first one, negotiating the book cover?
Yes.
Okay, so negotiating conflict in Lebanon, bordering practices in a divided Beirut, offers an alternative way of thinking about borders. It moves away from considering borders simply as artifacts that produce physical division in the form of walls and fences, and that were used to describe Beirut's divisions and the green line of the civil war between 1975 and 1990, and put forward an understanding of how borders are produced as forms of material and creative processes and practices embedded in the everyday life of city dwellers. At the heart of this book is the idea that borders are specific kinds of spatial practice, what I call bordering practice. And these practices are played out through processes of negotiation and narration, and they amount to political strategies and tactics that relate to everyday life. And my focus is on the immateriality, spatiality, and temporality of these bordering practices in the everyday spaces of the contested city of Beirut. In this context, negotiation emerges as an active response by residents who wish to engage with the conflict while restoring a sense of normality in situations that attempt to dehumanize and marginalize them. It is a bordering practice, a continuous one, that deals with the contested space between opposites and where the condition of division is lived and is not necessarily demarcated by 2 separate sides. So it's within this immensity. So this is a practice-led and site-specific research project that worked with residents, engaging them with a range of exercises using a variety of media in this process of negotiating conflict. This includes documenting the narratives that they tell and exchange about the conflict. In addition, there are the negotiations and the narratives that are produced out of the research itself in the form of artworks, gallery installations, and writings, such as the book. And these activities highlighted the central themes of the book's 4 projects, and these constitute the borders of its chapters: administration, surveillance, sound, and displacement. But before going into the project and chapters, I'll present a couple of points from the introduction of the book that are important to its conception. Civil unrest in Lebanon resurfaced after the assassination of former Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri on 14 February 2005. And this is the context that the book studies. The assassination led to the withdrawal of the Syrian troops from Lebanon in May 2005, 30 years after their arrival in the country. And these events polarized the country and resulted in the formation of two main political blocs: the pro-Syrian 8 March bloc, which included the Shiite Hezbollah and was allied with Iran, and the 14 March bloc, which accused the Syrian regime of carrying out the assassination and included the Prime Minister's Sunni party and was allied with Saudi Arabia and the West. So the events took on a sectarian dimension because of the political schism between Sunnis and Shiites. Of course, not all Sunnis were affiliated with 14th of March, nor all Shiites were 8th of March, but the blocs were led by politically representative parties of each sect. Christians were also divided between political alliances with one bloc or the other. So this new wave of conflict imposed a new set of spatial practices and a variety of physical borders in the urban space that gradually emerged and intensified, from protest to security checkpoints to demarcation lines, and later on violent clashes that cut across neighborhoods and communities, particularly in 2008 in what was called 7 May clashes. But as the conflict continued, I became more interested in how these divisions extended beyond their physical occurrences into the immateriality of residents' everyday spatial practices and social life, and in the form of invisible, ephemeral bordering practices. For example, when W.A. looked at the tree outside her living space, she recalled the rocket-propelled grenade fired from the adjacent neighborhood that had passed through the tree and her line of sight. A.A. told me she had removed her husband's surname and hence any clue about his sectarian background and political affiliation from the intercom at the building entrance to prevent any possible harassment. I.A. looked at the television monitor in her shop and talked to me about the censorship imposed by the satellite provider who had removed a particular television channel due to the provider's opposition to this channel political affiliation. And in the course of my research, S.H. stopped visiting her sister in the adjacent neighborhood, fearing that she and her daughter might be harassed by the militia members who patrolled the streets. So throughout my research, I have been gathering and documenting a list of bordering practices, and these bordering practices vary in the ways in which they occupy spaces, their locations, durations, materials, and uses. For example, men gathering and patrolling the streets of their neighborhood and represented under the surveillance category, and motorcycle convoys displaying political flags, for instance, presented under the mobile and audible category. So these practices also vary in the specifics of their practitioners, whether they be residents, politicians, militia, or the army. So these practices narrated and experienced by the residents are manifestations of the speciality of the Lebanese conflict, imposing constraints on residents' mobility, their social interaction, their decisions about where to live, and even their future plans. And I refer to the ongoing Lebanese conflict as political sectarian in order to propose the dialectic of politics and religion in producing social life, and that intertwines with the economic. However, it is the speciality of this conflict and its bordering practice in urban space that I explore in this book. And I focus on the interrelated processes of the political sectarian narrative and material reality or everyday life, how one produces the other. In one sense, narrative is linguistic, and in another, it is materialized in space and through acts of spatial division and connection. As such, I explore the political sectarian narrative as a practice, lived and constructed over time and capable of changing. And the research produces new representations and counter-narratives that expose the politics of production of dominant narratives. And I kind of analyze them into layers. So in the introduction of the book, I provide a theoretical framework to these bordering practices that, although I am studying them in the context of Beirut's political sectarian conflict, they could be observed in many of the world's cities in relation to racial segregation in the US, or exclusionary politics and discrimination against minority groups and others in Europe and the UK. So I extend the definition of bordering practice from the sociological use of the term in border studies. Often it's used in the context of states' control and governance and observed in traditional border control sites such as ports and airports. And I define it in close relation to theory of space, everyday life, and spatial practice, as defined by Henri Lefebvre and Michel de Certeau in relation to power positions, and as critical spatial practice, as defined by Jane Rendell in its aim for social and political change. And I do that in order to understand the political dimension of these bordering practices as strategies of division or tactics of resistance through which subjects or residents oppose and negotiate the conflict mechanisms. So I define bordering practices as practices that construct material and immaterial borders as part of the socio-spatial interaction between individuals in time, as well as those practices that negotiate the splits created by existing borders by crossing and transforming them. As such, bordering practice is also the site of counter practices, tactical and or critical. So to that extent, the book considers how artistic research can itself be seen as a form of critical spatial practice, and in particular, a bordering practice, what I term critical bordering practice. And consequently, the book proposes a method of negotiating. This is how artistic research can negotiate the conflict and narrate the conflict mechanisms, can propose spatial alternatives to borders, as well as critically reflect upon its own bordering activities. And finally, to transform certain border positions, such as the divisive positions of dominant political and sectarian narratives. And my project involved producing artwork that are a critical bordering practice. And the research project method is a crucial part of this critical bordering practice. I adopted ethnographic and practice-led research methods to work with residents located between two adjacent areas of Tariq al-Jadidi and Mazra'a, both situated within the Mazra'a district in Beirut, as shown in this map, and of different political affiliations, divided across Sunni and Shiite lines, and with a Christian minority in the northern side, in the Mazra'a. These areas have witnessed demarcation lines on the Mazra'a main road, separating them here, represented in a green line. And the areas are an example of how the political sectarian division is played out at a micro level within a particular neighborhood of Beirut. So the method, this bordering method, responds to the conditions of borders, to censorship, and the challenges of conducting research in areas of conflict, particularly within the political constraints back then on residents' and researchers' practices due to the militarization of urban space. For example, video recording and taking photographs in public spaces were monitored and questioned by political party personnel and civilians. So my chosen research method retreated from the outdoor public politics and re-entered or accessed the neighborhood by partnering with residents and through the private interior of their spaces, their houses, balconies, shops, and cars. So this approach was not merely practical. It also took into account, in the context of social and political division, it took into account residents' differences and subjectivities that shaped how they related to conflict and how we could build knowledge about their experience out of this condition of division. So it's about the subjectivities of borders. This bordering method also positioned my research and myself in between many places, interior and exterior, private and public. It is also positioned between the media I employ, such as audio and video, and the representations I produce, such as text and image. But out of 80 interviews in and off the site of Mazra'a, I selected 4 pairs of narratives that are themselves forms of border crossing that negotiate the physical line of division between both areas. So the residents' narratives and their associated borders constitute the book's 4 chapters. The immaterial borders of administration, for example, manage the everyday life of residents and materially shape the urban space through forms of representation and procedure. They are everywhere and nowhere, and they provide the urban framework in which everyday bordering practices operate. Surveillance apparatuses are spatially fixed in urban knots, yet its gaze crosses the private spaces and lives of residents through a reach that is both immaterial and emotional. The temporality of sound, being mobile and short-lived, is used at times of retreat and reduced tension to substitute for the physical occupation of space. Whereas the spatiality of displacement is characterized by matching geographies with politics, and it is invisible at an urban scale compared to the forced displacements of the past civil war. However, it's temporally and continually shaped by the violent memories of these forced displacements. So for each chapter, there are 3 stages for its narratives as the slide shows, and this is reflected in the titles. There is the border condition to be explored, such as administration, then the research projects title that negotiate that particular border, and the proposed new bordering practice that comes out of the research and the art installation, such as hiding, crossing, and so on. And I start with the bordering practice of hiding that negotiated the border activity of administration through the project and installation, The Chosen Two. And I worked with a Mukhtar character who is an elected district's representative and created a dialogue between him and the fictional Mukhtar from a television series, Ghenwa Hayek, from the 70s and 80s. And in this chapter, I explore the boundary between fact and fiction to reveal the bordering inherent in the workings of administrative representation and administrative narratives. And the Mukhtar's use of official documents as answers to my question when I formally interviewed him at his office inspired the conception of the project. And you can see them here on the screen, all these documents that he used to answer and where they come from at his office. So the proposition of hiding was to consider how the administrative practices seek to hide borders, either intentionally for political reasons or unintentionally because of the inadequacy of the representational techniques followed in political representation and procedures. And in the gallery space, the juxtaposition of the actual Mukhtar and the fictional Mukhtar in one space as part of the multimedia art installation of video, audio, and textual material aimed to expose the discrepancies in the workings of representation in administrative procedures and narratives structure. Another bordering practice was the crossing of surveillance borders with 2 women through the project at her balcony. And the chapter explores bordering through the culture of visuality and the delineation of distances and differences in relation to gender politics, as well as practices of observation and documentation that are part of the practices of political surveillance, art, and research. So the chapter builds on the differences between how the 2 residents saw and related to the surveillance of their neighborhood and operated by male political party personnel. And I employed photography at the women balconies to inquire about the possibility of obtaining a neighborhood panorama and to photograph and document surveillance. One woman saw surveillance as a threat, and photography was restricted at her balcony. This is to the right. And the other saw surveillance as security, and photography was allowed with caution. So the bordering practice of crossing proposed here was a visual and a physical activity that used photography from the balcony to cross distances and a video recording camouflaged in a car journey that I took 10 days after the photography exercise. And this activity of crossing geographical, emotional, and political distances through photography and filming was explored in a multimedia installation that allowed me to expand and comprehend the neighborhood panorama scene that had been restricted due to surveillance. There is the bordering practice of translating the immateriality of sound borders with taxi drivers through the project This Is How Stories of Conflict Circulate and Resonate. Examples of sonic borders are the use of fireworks, political speeches, and songs to confront the ear of others from a different political affiliation. And the chapter explores the boundary between the visual and the auditory, the seen and the heard, and their alternating role in the practice of bordering and experiencing the world. So the research involved recordings from the space of taxi drivers while they are crossing contested neighborhoods and a walking journey. And the proposed bordering practice of translating was a material process between sound and image and a linguistic process between Arabic and English. And the narratives of the film and the audiovisual piece produced out of this process examine the content of current sonic material, such as political events and news broadcasts from shops and cars, revealing their politicization and similarity to past conflicts that are still recurring. And the process of translating as a bordering practice removed these sounds from their original spatial and temporal context and brought the sound of old events into the present moment. As such, it collapsed time-space distances as well as the borders between them. And finally, there is the bordering practice of matching lines of displacement between twin sisters. The sisters decided to swap houses to match the political affiliation of their husbands with the political affiliation of the area where they live. So the husbands were living in the wrong area, outside their political affiliation. However, their swapping houses plan was continually postponed and always about to happen due to the ever-changing political situation in the country. And the work with the sisters included drawing the route map from one sister's house to another and tracking it on the city skyline across a visual horizon in search for the other sister using a video camera. And the narrative of the video installation constructed out of the work with the sisters aims to match divided geographies and to mobilize and visualize the sisters' invisible displacement in a continuous time of about to. So this type of self-displacement is suggested or indirectly forced by political leaders onto residents who perform it. And it is one that confirms the ultimate state of division of people and geography. So I will conclude on the chapters with a few points. So the 4 new bordering practices I constructed of hiding and illustration, crossing surveillance, translating sound, matching displacement, aimed to work against divides and to intervene in the space between. The narratives produced in the form of art installations transformed the speciality of the political sectarian narratives that they negotiated and documented into multiple shifting representations and practices. These works were critical bordering practices in that they created their own places between spaces, times, representations, and media. And they displaced the conditions of the borders as well as their materiality between 2 sites, the urban space under research and the gallery space under construction. And this critical bordering practice was also concerned with the practices that researchers and artists employ to study borders. And I consider these research and artistic practices to be inseparable from the politics of the borders that are being investigated. And so I argue that the narratives produced are forms of bordering practice in their own right. So now in the epilogue of the book, I reflect on the temporal aspect of the bordering practices, how as an element of confrontation and control, time is deployed in the bordering practices associated with the current conflict. And I focus on the temporal dimension of bordering practice as tactical practice of resistance by residents as well as artists in claiming city spaces, particularly thinking of the most recent practices of civil society in Lebanon in their battle against the economic crisis and political corruption. So kind of practice of resistance depend on time as they do not have a proper place, however, without fully colliding with the present moment or colonizing it. So they see space as a dynamic, inclusive domain, contrary to place control and place acquisition and institutionalized border, which are all conflict strategies. And one can ask, in response to the dangers threatening the existence of cities and countries, how can the ongoing political sectarian conflict be challenged? And what are the possibilities for operating outside existing narratives and the forced borders of politics? What is the nature of the next practices of resistance? I will stop here and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Mohamad, for this overview, this trip really through your analysis, your artistic input. I think some of the quality of the beautiful visuals in the book are lost to the Zoom interface. So I really want to recommend to everyone that you also pick up the book. I didn't get to show you the first time. It's, as I'm sure you felt through Mohamad's analysis, fantastic layers of analysis and readings of space, but also really outstanding visuals. It's now my turn today to discuss, so I leave the floor to Sara. Professor Fregonese, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you everyone for being here. I hope I don't get a screaming child into the room suddenly, but anyway. Thank you, Mona, for inviting us, and Mohamad, it was a pleasure to have the opportunity to engage with your book. It was a very welcome diversion from the past 7 weeks of marking student work for me, so it eases me very well into the summer. Negotiating conflict is a great immersion into the everyday urban experience. It is beautifully designed and illustrated, as Mona just said, and it can be read as an academic treatise, but also as a source of architectural and artistic reflection and action. And this book left me with obviously many thoughts and its variations, but I want to point out mainly 3 aspects that then lead to a couple of questions. I originally had 2, but then you answered one in your talk. So if I have time, I'll do 2. So the first point I wanted that this book really brought for me is about the notion of the border itself. Using the notion of borders when talking about Lebanon is a powerful thing because traditional border concepts obviously assume the presence of a state sovereignty that is coherent and that is spread over a contiguous and well-contoured territory. And as we know, this is a reductive view to apply to Lebanon, to say the least. And so the borders of negotiating conflict are instead closer to what Lauren Martin and co-authors in 2017 called polymorphic borders. They are borders that do not map onto the territoriality of the state, and they do not map onto accepted notions of scale. They are more rhizomatic somehow. They act towards a variety of forms, agencies, and things and practices. And ethnography is extremely well placed to investigate these kinds of borders. So this is the first thing that jumps to the eye. We need more of this bordering analysis especially for a place like Beirut and for Lebanon. The second point takes this rhizomatic border and is about sectarianism and its pervasiveness. And for me, what the 4 bordering practices that you have worked on, Mohamad, in negotiating conflict, what they bring into view is how political sectarianism is an apparatus that pervades the everyday, but doesn't quite completely encircle it coherently. It's not a big plan that is always there and very, very visible. It's actually a very scattered and multilinear, multi-layered and very contradictory and very inconsistent. And it works its way in a rhizomatic fashion through space as well as through time. And for me, negotiating conflict, what it made really visible, and that image of the patchwork of photos of Masra becoming increasingly violent is so telling. What it makes manifest is how time falls into space, and how spatial histories of tension, of division resurface in shaping how not only residents live the present, but also how they imagine their future, okay, and how they calibrate it and anticipate it. And this for me is important beyond academia. It's important for diplomacy, for conflict management practitioners, for urban practitioners, and for humanitarian workers, because what the book exposes is the recurring of fault lines, where lines plural, where confrontations periodically flare up in specific locales, and they don't do this by chance. They do it, it has happened before in the same places, it recurs. And these are very important geographies that need to be voiced, especially when the practitioners I just mentioned often approach urban issues in contexts that they might not always know in depth. Okay, so it's that contextuality and that importance of drawing attention on these flare-up points that might be chronic, but not in a very irrational way. There are histories and genealogies there, okay, that is important to decode and to voice. And this leads to my third point about the importance of the micro and of non-human aspects of everyday life. And I like negotiating conflict because things, objects, technologies, they are always there. It's a full immersion for me, and even when they are barely detectable, like the movement of a surveillance camera or the fluctuation in the wording of a conversation heard on the street from a taxi. This relation between people and things in the sort of Kobayashi sense of spatiality is at the core of the book, and I think that you really bring this out very well. And these objects have a lot of agency. They make humans do or not do things in a certain way. They make them take specific decisions or not take decisions or postpone decisions, right? To move house, to swap. And these are very individual, domestic, personal decisions and behaviors. But they are the common denominator is that they are all very connected to the urban politics that they are made present in. Okay, and this is important. Why? Because for a long time, in the West at least, we have been told that the only relevant way of producing political meaning is, and to make political decision, is through the framework of the nation state. So we reason politically in terms of the macro, so the state borders and the international relations and the regional conjuncture and whatever. So the subnational, the micro, the interior space, even the spaces at the threshold of detectability, so to say, they have been somehow epistemologically disconnected from what constitutes politics for a long time. And this book instead puts the micro at the very core of politics and also as a terrain of action, of renegotiation, of predominant narratives. And this takes me to my two questions, okay, for you. So the first is about the notion of third space and the possibility of hope and the nature of resistance, which you brought up in your last point, Mohamad. The book uses Edward Soja and the notion of third space. It shows division as lived space and as a space where participants engage consciously with being in division, okay? And it's a realm where the accepted social and spatial practices are reorganized, deconstructed, and potentially put back together to go beyond a status quo. You also mention retreating into the space of the gallery at the end of the book as a safe space to be able to actually shape these spaces of renegotiation, these third spaces. My question to you is, do you see your critical border practices as hopeful spaces at the current conjuncture in Beirut and Lebanon? And if so, how can these third spaces be nurtured and operationalized if they're not already? If I have 1 minute, I want to ask you a second slightly provocative question is, can we go beyond representation and even territory in your, if you had to write a afterword to your book nowadays, how can we perhaps go beyond the notion itself of territory? And you know, I'm referring especially to your beautiful chapter about sound, and I engaged with the with your work on Look, Someone is Filming previously with a paper that is about to come out actually. And I love the fact that these are not only territory borders on land, but these are perturbations. Yeah, the sound that creates sectarian territorialization hovers over. It's an ambience rather than a line on the ground. And I'm wondering, you know, can we engage more with these immaterialities in the sense of the elemental, you know, with the mechanics of sound and all of the elements that sustain a city like Beirut, where the political sectarianism is so present at the moment. Diesel, electricity, of course, pollution, fumes, explosive, water, sand, soil, all of these bare elements that also are terrains for contestation. So these were my interventions. And thank you. This was an amazing book to go through.
Thank you, Sara, and thank you really for capturing so much of the book and bringing it to the question and to the current moment. This was great. Maybe we can take all the discussions and then let you answer. So we are going to move to Dr. Khoury. Tania, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, I first want to acknowledge that I'm speaking today from the occupied sacred homelands of the Munsee and the Mohawk people, colonially known as the Hudson Valley of New York. I also want to acknowledge and extend my solidarity to everyone who's currently living in Beirut, in Lebanon, dealing with the brutal necropolitics of its regime. And thank you, Beirut Urban Lab, for inviting me to engage with such an important and innovative book project by the always inspiring Mohamad Hafeda, whom we are celebrating today. And obviously, I'm not going to discuss the book's contribution to the fields of geography and urbanism, especially after Sara Fregonese. So my reading of Mohamad's book is naturally informed by my own practice as an artist working with interactivity and from the site-specific project I have created in Lebanon as part of Dictaphone Group, the Urban Research and Live Art Collective. Negotiating conflicts acts as an archive, an artwork, a research, and for me, even a performance. Both its content and its form practice, practice the very work ethics and politics that the author champions. It centers multidisciplinarity, community-driven collaboration, and a centrality of site specificity in researching spatial practices. As someone who have often argued that art is not merely a tool to disseminate academic research, but also is a knowledge producer, a research engine by itself, I particularly appreciate that negotiating conflicts did not only call for such regarding of art, but has showed its readers how it's done. As a reader, one is not entirely sure what comes first. You know, what informs the other: site-specific research, art installations, theory, oral history, mapping, and photography, are all tools with equal importance without the traditional association and the hierarchical roles that we know both in art and academia. What is a border made of? Asks Mohamad, while explaining that a border can disappear. These man-made borders, or should we call them man-practiced borders, with the emphasis on the man, are not merely physical divisions, but rather processes and practices that are both hyper-present in our everyday while maintaining that superpower of invisibility. When living in Beirut, our eyes and ears and perhaps all our senses get accustomed to the various border practices that our generation has been subjected to since day one. What this book does is heightening our senses and spatial awareness. And for those of us who are not in Beirut right now, the book taps on our sensorial memories and leave us more attuned to the visible and invisible bordering practices that limit or have limited our daily lives in Beirut. The design of the book is magnificent, as both Mona and Sara pointed out. As Mohamad explained, his research took seriously the emotional and social experience of residents who encountered these borders on a daily basis. For me, the design of the book shows that the author also takes seriously the emotional and sensorial experience of the reader. While the book discusses bordering practices, as Mohamad explained in his presentation, through administration, surveillance, sound, and displacement, I particularly appreciate the work on sound and how it's used as a temporal border and a weapon instrumentalized in politico-sectarian battles. Beirut, as we all know, is a noisy city. One can even claim it is offensive to the ear, especially in relation to how small it is geographically. When I lived in London and would often travel between Beirut and London, I would always find myself surprised the first day I wake up in London and actually hear complete silence in a city of, 9 million people, after having been in what Mohamad seems to describe as a sort of sound war in Beirut. For some reason, very few artwork and research has been done on Beirut soundscape, which makes Mohamad's contribution even more important. Sound is often used as a weapon. Not many people are aware of this, but in researching state violence, I recently discovered that police in the US use sound weapons to disperse crowds and oppress protests, namely the long-range acoustic devices known as LRAD. So a sound is able to make you lose your balance. Some are powerful enough to make you feel actually physically sick. The last point I want to make about Mohammad's work is my reading of it as a live art event. The liveness here is not just in the moment that the audience or the reader gets exposed to the outcome of the work, but is a process conducted throughout the project. For example, Mohamad does not only write about or analyzes surveillance in Beirut, but he actually lives it, is subjected to it while creating this project. The scenes he presents are ephemeral, just like performances, whether they're a man-only Ergile place turned into a space of bordering and surveillance, whether it's that balcony as a demarcation space through flags and posters. These are all time-based, interactive, and immersive, often disappearing without leaving a physical trace behind. And perhaps like performances, these disappearing borders are able to alter people's emotions as they take them by surprise. Mohamad collaborated with 80 people. These people were not participants in the way we think about participation as an act of generosity by the maker. The notion of participation, as you all know, is deceiving, just like participatory politics, participatory architecture, participatory urbanism. Mohammad's 80 people are collaborators, and I read their relationship in a lens of interactivity. Interactivity allows collaboration to shift the narrative, transform the project, and affects its outcome. Interactivity forces the maker to adapt, relearn, and co-create. And that is one of the many beautiful achievements of this book project. Thank you.
Thank you, Tania, really for bringing this fantastic new light to the book and really adding to the discussion with another outlook on senses and performance that are really very welcome. So really, thank you so much for these comments. Last but not least, Ghenwa, Professor Hayek, the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks, Mona. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Mohammed, for writing such a wonderful book and for helping me think productively and not hopelessly about Lebanon for the first time in a long time. So I mean, Sara and Tania are hard acts to follow. So I don't think I'm going to follow them so much as just think with you and maybe everyone here about some of the issues that the book raised for me. I think one of the wonderful contributions of this book, in addition to the ones that Sara and Tania have already mentioned, is its contribution to writing the history of Beirut's present. It's, you know, these texts are few and far between. They're starting to come. It's a dizzying present. You know, I hyperventilate every time I think about how much has happened since 2005, between 2005 and even 2019, let alone over the past 2 years. But I think that there is a sort of a need to start mapping out the past decades. And Mohammed, you have shown us how to do this, right? Through this interdisciplinary method, through this care that you have taken towards your collaborators, towards these, towards the urban text that is Mazra'a, towards the sort of thinking about the city in all the ways that Sara and Tania have sort of laid out for us already today. I want to talk about, I want to ask you, actually, I don't really want to talk. I want to ask you about a couple of things. I've been thinking a lot about, I mean, as you know, my work often, when it's about Beirut, deals with memory. And I know that memory is something that you're interested in, and the mapping of the memory in the present. And more recently, and I think for obvious reasons, given, you know, Lebanon, I've sort of come on this term that I first read applied to the Beirut context in Carla Calage's book on memory, and that is anamnesis. And anamnesis, the thing that's attractive to me about anamnesis is that it's both a medical concept and a philosophical concept. So philosophically, it is the sort of the recalling of an embodied past. And medically, it is what happens when you describe to your doctor your symptoms, so your medical history. So when you sit there and say, you know, I, you know, started feeling this way 4 years ago, and then I lost use of my arm and whatever. So there's something about the sort of terminology to describe the act of recalling, but also sort of the sort of the physiology of illness and disease that that anamnesis, I think, does a lot of work here. And I think your work is a work of showing us some of this memory work, how it can happen on an individual everyday level, but also sort of not shying away from showing us the sort of the medical trauma and the, I mean, medical trauma, the trauma that you know, urban inhabitants of Beirut live, even as they're negotiating their presence. So there's something sort of very attractive there in that kind of, in those conversations that you're having. And both in the, as Tania was saying, both in the way that they sort of make visible to make visible your participants' affective relationship to this space, but also trigger in readers this sort of, this process itself, right? This process of thinking through. And then the other concept that I was sort of, that really drew me in this text, and here I kind of betray myself as a literary scholar, is your work on translation, and specifically how the sort of the way in which you, translation for you is a site of play, and it's a site of juxtaposition that is unapologetic in its sort of in its force and its power. So the way, particularly in the section on the Mukhtar, but also again, when you're translating the sounds, the way Arabic and English are juxtaposed, but also the way that there are deliberate mistranslations and you're forced to, or if you have the privilege of inhabiting both or being able to understand both, there's an element of this work that becomes more intimate and playful. And I mean, I know that this is a sort of, I would love to hear you think about playfulness and translation, and particularly the way, I mean, I'm very interested in, particularly with the linguistic translation, why that is the content, why that is the border that is made manifest in the art, where the conflict between Arabic and English, or I mean, it's not a conflict, but when the where the tension is made most manifest. Because I think that the art, I mean, the art is palimpsestic, as I experience it on the page. I never got to see it live, but the translation is kind of more interesting, and I'd love, not more interesting, the translation does something really interesting with its juxtapositions that I'd love to hear about, hear you think about. The other thing that finally, I mean, so Sara and Tania already talked about spaces of intimacy, and particularly the gendered spaces of public. And I'm sort of very curious about how you feel about the fact that the domestic space is so heavily feminized in this work, and whether you had any encounters with men in their homes that you sort of left out, or, I mean, we have mentions of women on the street in the sense of the women who refuse to use the street. But I'm wondering if you can give us a few examples of situations in which, you know, these less typical, but also very common, right? Women are everywhere on the street in Beirut, and men are in their homes, sadly now, most of the time in Lebanon. So I'm wondering if you have any reflections on those particular gendered spaces, and the way that they may have, you know, they may shed a new kind of perspective on this project. Thank you.
Thank you, Ghenwa. Wow, that was great, and thank you for raising the gender question. I think it's a very important one. It's really wonderful to see three different perspectives, three coming from both an interrogative and appreciative lens to the book. Mohammed, I don't want to be you. I'm glad you're here to answer.
What do I do after that? How do I deal with that?
The floor is yours.
I really felt, just to start, but I really felt emotional, just to say. I mean, it's such a generous thing for people like you really to engage with my work, and to hear yeah, these all really beautiful comments, and kind of really unfolded the project. You animated the book more than my presentation, because it has structure, and what you have done, you kind of made something much interesting than, you know, presenting a PowerPoint PDF. You exploded the work, and thank you so much for taking the time, for thinking, and for feeding back to me, and make me more excited about what I'm working, because I am also, like you, at a very difficult position where you think, okay, what is next? Particularly when we think of the possibilities of any work to be done at the moment in Beirut, or about Beirut, or Lebanon in general. So we do not just keep, you know, kind of saying Beirut to mean Lebanon, about the whole country. Really lovely ideas. I mean, Sarah, kind of from a geographical or urban policies point of view, you really highlighted amazing things. And you have a question for me, which is, how do I see bordering as a kind of hopeful practices? Am I correct for the future? Can we go beyond representation? And in a way, and surely you talked about many other things, about the third space, about perhaps, yes, the in-between. and this is exactly in the heart, I think, of the work, how we can work against binary positions that usually produce the logic of borders. So the whole work about negotiating these binaries and trying to see them in different location when it comes to the practices of conflict in Lebanon. Particularly in the epilogue, I try to reflect or to cut across the whole chapters, thinking of temporality in a way, thinking of it as a possibility for the future. And I really still don't understand what I mean by that. I'm going to be very honest, and I'm working on it. My new project is all about that. And I'm still trying to understand, what do I mean by temporal practice, a practice of resistance. And I'm producing work around that. I'm working now in the context of displacement in the UK, working particularly with refugee Syrians during the resettlement process. I'm thinking of issues of temporality and how time is used as a form of border, but also how time from the side of people is used as a form of tactic and resistance. I can report about this work maybe in a couple of months. And I just started yesterday new activities with people because I'm allowed now. So surely I'm thinking of the relational when we talk about temporality. So the relational is one thing to think of. But I did learn from my work that when we talk about temporality, when we talk about the relational, we should not necessarily dismiss the physical. It's really about how we understand space, physicality, spatiality. And this is what I tried to kind of comment on at the end of the talk. So thinking about space as a dynamic, inclusive domain, thinking about things that are not necessarily static as kind of institutions would usually propose, the logic of state institutions, about things that are, and I'm here reflecting and referring a lot to the ideas of de Certeau in his distinction between the definition of space and place, that I find it helpful. And also he talks about time as the refuge of tactics or people, those kind of as kind of tactics of resistance, as if it is the place of tactics of resistance. So surely, the relational is something to think of, thinking of temporality, and I'm thinking of temporality in relation to art practices, to participation, participatory art, and how these could become processes also to kind of unsettle and to undo a certain hegemony, certain ways of doing things, certain kind of dominant representations. So I'm referring to kind of all of these as a way to investigate, to learn, to start with, and later on to produce. And these productions, I always wish for these productions to have this kind of the ephemerality somehow. And I'm surely interested in that. But I'm also, you asked me about representation. I really come from a background through my work in fabric, where it's really about participatory work in context, particularly in refugee camps, where art practices, design practices, our expertise as architects and people who are involved in urban practice are all used to with the community to kind of create a kind of a change in the built environment. And I'm talking, we used to talk a lot about small change. So I come from that background where the projects usually are useful. However, they are always reflective. They are always poetic too. And in this project, you see lots, I kind of go back to the idea of the representations more, to the idea of the gallery as a space, as I say in the conclusion. It took me a while to understand because I struggled with that. I said, why I'm producing work to a gallery? And I come from a very different background, but I did feel that the gallery was a safe space, but also kind of, it's an interesting space to discuss critically ideas that are not necessarily possible or urgent in the urban site. You know, so there's another level of discussion, another level of practice that art practice, and particularly the gallery, could provide. So I hope I responded, Sarah. You can tell me if I went really off. And then, and Tania, Tania, thank you also so much for talking about the book design, talking about performance, because I don't say it, but lately I use it as when I talk informally with someone. I say actually what I do, I perform, I demonstrate and I perform the idea of political and sectarian narratives and practices, because I transform them from one domain to another. And for that to happen, I need to perform something. I need to dissect, to analyze, and to recreate something in order to make my point clear, in order to show how certain I don't want to use the word stories because it's way more than stories, how certain difficulties that, yes, could start as a narrative or could be also part of kind of people discourse, the kind of the extent they have in our life and how they are spatially take place. So surely there is this element of performance, but also it goes back to what you mentioned about participation and participatory art or collaboration, where these are never just static. So I enjoyed when you kind of highlighted that these are forms of documentation, forms of learning, and forms of knowledge production, and they are should be never seen as something static. They are used for that purpose. And I think this is a very valuable and important point, also to talk how artistic research and artistic practices is a form of research and is a form of knowledge production. And this is also in the heart, this is one of the aims of the work, particularly, and this maybe will take me back to Ghenwa, but before that, I want to talk also about the idea of collaboration that you highlighted, and even the ethics, the ethical role of these collaboration, which was so important in the work and something that wasn't clear at the beginning, and I kept developing throughout, trying to understand my position in the work in relation to the collaborators, the participants, and their role. Is it an active? Is it a passive? And I say that, and I kind of question that, when they are active, when they are passive. And I compare them to other kind of participatory projects, particularly in my work with Fabric, where the participants were really kind of more active, and where the outcome of the work always go back to them. Here, the outcome feed into different locations, and that's I'm okay with that. I think it also has value because we have these discussions, for example. So the ethical part becomes also very much part of structuring that relationship between me and the participants, and between me and the work. And that's why if we see the projects in real life, I mean, if we watch the videos and the installations, my position is always there. I am there in the work, and it's done just to say, to talk about my subjectivity, and just to show that this is how research, these are how also narratives are constructed. There's always subjectivity to that. There are many political positions to all of these narratives, and I am performing it. So this is where I enjoyed your comment about performance. But today I didn't show, so we've seen everything like stills. And Ghenwa, really thank you for bringing up this idea of history writing of contemporary Beirut. And I didn't want to claim that, because we're trying to be humble too. And when we write, but again, it is something surely there, particularly in the chapter on the Mukhtar. I tried, one of the question was, how can I do historic research as a practice, as an exercise? So I turned it into something that I physically, emotionally engage with. And this is where the kind of the dialogue or the interview with the Mukhtar came to become part of the work. So through him, I exercised historic research through this idea of the interviewing, but also where that interview took me to other locations, to the archive and to other places. So it took me to locations outside the office where I had to dig further in order to read and write the history of Mazra'a. And I cannot claim that I provided a holistic, it's just, a fragment of history. It's a small fragment of history, but it is about exercising history, how we can do that as an exercise, as a practice. And I'm very happy that you also picked on the concept of translation, which is very dear to my heart, and I'm still developing it in all my work. I'm like in my sewing borders, the film, the translation is so much part of it. And I became aware of the translation after I did the first project, which was at her balcony, which all the text was in English. And I was in London. So the research happened in Beirut. I delivered installation in London, and it was in English. And once I put it installed there, I felt there's something wrong. And then I thought this has to be part of the work. And we are talking about, about these bordering, about cultural bordering, but also about my position. What does it mean to have, to research Beirut and to deliver outside? Where is my position here as also Lebanese living in between places? How am I also lost between two languages? And I kind of employed that to start explore, to further explore the extension of bordering linguistically, but also to talk about anyway how narratives and how representation operate. So I use translation again to perform and to demonstrate the idea of how narratives are constructed, how representations could operate, but also I enjoy a lot Walter Benjamin's work on translation and even Homi Bhabha, and I refer to them a lot, and about translation as the process of producing the new, and also the untranslatability in Walter Benjamin's work, and how it is also a form of resistance and production of the new. And I play on that, the decision of when to translate, when not to translate, and when I make, where do I use two languages, and I kind of play with this kind of hierarchy between languages, and I kind of collapse this hierarchy. So there's also the layer of transcribing that I work with. It's not just translation, transcribing in Arabic to Lebanese, also as a form of translating from the audible or the oral into the written and into the visual. So it's another process that I employ to turn the immaterial into material, to make something that is so mundane visible, perhaps to formalize it. So kind of ask people, let's look at it, let's read it. For example, the sonic material in Beirut, and the importance of not just translating them, of just simply writing them in Arabic to a local reader. So yeah, so translation become, and I'm playing on this idea of translation differently in each of the projects. And I'm exploring different ways. And I totally agree with you, the kind of the decision when to translate and when not to translate. So it becomes a very powerful, it gives me agency. It gives, and it positions me in that in-between spaces. and I'm using that. Yeah, I used it also in sewing borders, and my new work now. Only yesterday I thought, am I going to explore that further, or I need to just, to explore something new so I don't repeat. So this is really an important point. Thank you. And the gendered spaces, it took me a while to understand. It's lots of female in the work. But actually, no, it's not like female. I mean, Mona has really beautiful essay that on surveillance, Mona and Ahman and Mona. So they talk beautifully about gendered spaces, particularly in relation to surveillance, and I refer to their work. In addition, also to Joseph, Suad Joseph's work, and that I find also helpful in relation to the idea of the patriarchy of state institutions and how this is translated or extended to kind of the male domination. This is the way I explained it, and the way they operate surveillance on the streets of Beirut. So it has roots from our patriarchal society, later on to state institutions, and now to these practices of bordering in the current conflict. So it extends from there. And with the woman balcony, I did use the female space as a safe space again. And through them, I negotiated the male surveillance in the neighborhood. They provided protection. But again, I was very much aware of that, and I tried to include it part of the work, because surely male surveillance is, is gendered, is a male practice. But in the work, the fact that they were female, it allowed kind of a small kind of space for negotiation with them, particularly with one of them who was more brave or playful, or she didn't care much, and she was able to confront more the kind of the militia personnel in her neighborhood. So it's again an opportunity to talk about boundaries in Lebanon, because every chapter took like as I said, the first one, it was about administration, about representation, about narratives, fiction, and here fiction and fact are employed. In this one, it was about, I used that gender linked to practice of visuality, and then talking about the also the space between the video and photography. So many kind of boundaries that I'm exploring, again, to unpack a certain context and talk about its complexities, and to show it simply, to show how it operates, how again the speciality of our conflict, political conflict, how it works, how we can understand it, how we can see it, hear it, sense it, and how hopefully we can change it. So yeah, spaces of intimacy. I think I felt, yeah, it was the only way. This was a very, it started as really a very, what's the word, like a voluntary, unconscious thing. I needed to be with someone. I felt safe in the interior of residents of Beirut. And so there was I talk about trust in the work. There was a very short contract of trust between me and the participants, and they were able really to protect me, even though they didn't all of them know me well. And I enjoyed that, and I used it, and I hope I didn't abuse it. So trust is something that I talk a little bit about, even though it's, I'm not sure if we can theorize it, because these are really ephemeral moments with some of the participants, where this moment of trust and protection take place, and where something has been in the site about the politics of the site has been unfolded, and where I capture it with them and narrate it differently. So yeah, intimate spaces, but also they could be one of these relational spaces. They could be the possibility, they could be the spaces of hope that Sarah asked about. Yeah, but I don't know, like I was talking with Mona at the start, it's a very difficult moment in Beirut, in Lebanon. And I don't know really if we are able to imagine at the moment any solution or any hopeful solution, or what's the role of art practice at the moment. I really don't know. It is very hard, isn't it?
Should I allow now? Am I interrupting, Mohammed? Did you want to answer?
No, that would be...
Thank you so much. That was really super rich and a lot of excellent answers and new directions to think through issues. I totally feel energized. We haven't really thought about and open on discussions beyond our everyday in so many ways. So I'm sure for people here in Beirut, at least, it's incredibly energizing to be thinking with a bit of distance about issues, and that's absolutely fantastic. I do have a quick question reaction, but I do want to leave first to the respondents. If you guys, I saw you nodding, smiling, reacting. So I wanted to give you a minute if there was something specific you wanted to answer and how Mohammed has answered your questions or each other's. I'm very conscious of time, but I think it's really important to hear you back. So should we do it reverse order and start with you, Ghenwa?
Sure. I mean, I'm going to just say, I think that, Mohammed, your responses sort of opened up new avenues of thinking, I think, in this conversation, and showed me at least how sort of hungry I am for these conversations. So I hope they keep going, and I hope you keep making more work. I'm sort of, your response about translation reminded me in the text of, and now I'm not going to be able to pull it up, but there's the bit of the conversation. I think you're having a conversation with the women on the balcony where you cut out the sentence and you superimpose it on another page. So there's always like a blank space. And then the other half is completed if your eye goes this way. And it reminded me of some of the conversation you were just bringing up about memory, and the way that the sort of the war is not part of this experience, right? It's part of, as Sarah was saying, and as Tania mentioned, it's part of the embodied memory of these spaces. So it's always there, and yet it's not necessarily there in the narratives that these people are using to describe their lives. And to go back to something that Mona was, I mean, I think at one moment, the everyday was a site of resistance for a lot of practitioners, cultural practitioners in Lebanon, a sort of a writing back against these sort of dominant big narratives about Beirut and about, but now it's interesting to hear Mona say it and to reflect on it, that every day itself has become the sort of primary occupation of so many people in Lebanon, and the people who care for them who are not in Lebanon. And we've sort of, we've lost perspective, right? So I'm also sort of just dazed by this lens that keeps shifting in and out and zooming in and out and forcing us to think with it all the time. It's very frantic. And I think that, you know, I think collectively, this is us trying to find trying to fix it, right? I mean, to use an image from photography, just trying to, just for 1 second, hold it stable so we can take this picture, so we can think collectively about it. And so, yeah. I don't know if that was
Thank you, Ghenwa. That's great. Tania, do you wanna do you wanna add something?
I just want to second what Ghenwa just said and what Mohammed also mentioned. It's just very hard to think outside the reality that we live right now, and we've been suggested to, especially in the last year. It's very hard to be in it, but also analyzing it and taking that distance on it. And on distance, I want to just appreciate what Mohamad said when he responded to us about his positionality, because I often struggle to find artists and writers' positionality, especially when they work with communities. They tend to work about communities rather than with communities, and we forget we can't see their positionality vis-a-vis people they're working with. So I just want to appreciate that, and I'd rather, you know, we hear from or open it to the public, because we spoke a lot so far.
Thank you, Tania. Thank you, Sarah.
Yes, thank you so much for giving the floor again to us, and I also look forward to hearing from the more general discussion from the audience here. I think just to echo Tania and Ghenwa's points, I think this is one of those talks where I come away energized with more questions than I had when I went in the good way, and I think it's just in a very good way. And the 2 points that I think for me are very important is this what Tania was saying about how, you know, being in the research, and also trying to distance yourself from it to sort of produce some knowledge. And for me this is very important, because the boundary in between experience and expertise for me is very relevant here. I am a very different, I have a very different positionality here, because I am the non-Lebanese. I wasn't born in Lebanon. I do not spend long periods of time in Lebanon. I did not do research where I am from, like Mohamad did for this book. And so I think it's very important to think of what kind of knowledge production do these borders between experience and expertise allow. And also I think related to that is the very important point of untranslatability as a form of resistance. And I'm wondering where we strike the balance between deciding when not to translate and respecting the untranslatability of contexts, but also striking the balance with not risking to fall into the trap of exceptionalizing a context to the point that it becomes unintelligible. So where do we, in that space in between untranslatability and unintelligibility, where do we situate ourselves as researchers? What do we learn from Beirut? Respecting its own uniqueness, but also not making it into this sort of pathological, untreatable, you know, entity, which we don't want to, right?
Yeah.
Yes, these are fantastic, even more fantastic questions in a very good way, Sarah. Thank you. So that was great. Thank you. Perhaps it's really time to ask people who are attending if they would like to raise a question. See, many of you have stayed with us. It's wonderful to see you here. There was a question in the Q&A that I think you answered already, Mohamad, about or addressed a little bit on notions of language and semantics as borders and divisions.
Yeah.
So
you can find it in chapter 1 and 3.
So I don't know if you guys want to unmute yourself, if someone wants to jump in, and if you want to unmute yourself, so I'm not taking over the whole.
Hello.
Hi, Ahmed. For those of you who don't know Ahmed, he is, among many other things, one of the co-founders of the Urban Lab and the designer of the fabulous poster. Ahmed, go ahead, please.
Hi, everybody. Hello, Mohamad. Thank you so much for the presentation and for the wonderful interventions by our guests today. It was really a pleasure to sit through this event. It's been a while that we haven't had something this refreshing. At least I can speak for myself. It was really, really wonderful. So, Mohamad, there's actually a lot to ask, a lot to talk about. So I'll try to maybe make a few comments and try to lead it towards a question, if possible, that's perhaps a little bit more selfish, that comes from our own work, our own experiences with borders, let's say. So, we, in the Urban Lab in general, and my work specifically with mapping and visualization in particular, we deal a lot with the question of borders. Often it is this kind of perpetual struggle, right? I mean, this kind of continuous negotiation between wanting them to be defined differently and challenge the way that they're kind of defined to begin with. I think Tania encapsulated it really well when she said borders have this magical ability to disappear. I want to pick up on a couple of points. First of all, I think Sara's intervention regarding the macro and the micro is wonderful and very important highlight in your work. Another way of putting it today would be to kind of advocate for small data at a time when everybody's talking about big data. So I think there's something very interesting about that kind of methodology in your work, and it also parallels a lot of the stuff that we kind of try to produce ourselves in terms of readings of the city, and particularly of Beirut in our own work. So, okay, I'll get to the point, but what I wanted to also tease out regarding this tension about borders, I mean, we always fall back on the same idea of this kind of metaphysics of representation, right? Borders are at once fabricated and real, man-made, with emphasis on man, Tania, but also lived by many, men and other, right? So there's this kind of there's this kind of tension, which I guess you tried in your work to highlight by introducing the ephemerality of borders and the way that they are practiced, and very delicately kind of traveling between sound and visual space, and so the sonic space, visual space, violent space, and all of these different spatialities. One example stood out to me personally, because it's something that we always talk about. A question that we always had in our work is how to represent sectarian borders, right? So, like I said, admittedly in our work, we always want to make certain borders disappear, but as mappers, we want to bring them back onto the map. And this idea of the cable box at home being a kind of an indicator of, well, not necessarily, I mean, if we want to simplify it, of sectarianism, of political affiliation at large through a kind of a selection of channels that you get, is something that we always kind of considered as a good indicator of sectarian distribution in Beirut. We never actually mapped it because it's, as you can imagine, very difficult to map. Maybe not actually, but it became increasingly difficult to map when people started watching less cable and more Netflix, actually, if you think about it, because it's no longer something that is, quite widely available in all the homes as it was at some point. But the reason why I'm mentioning specifically this example is because I think it's a wonderful, if you wish, symbolic kind of anecdote about this whole idea of how borders can shift between hard and soft very easily. Sorry, this is sounding like a long intervention. It was supposed to be like a simple question, but
nice.
But bear with me. So there's something very nice about this idea about how something like broadcast, right, which is, by definition, it works across borders, of how broadcast itself becomes another negotiation of a border. So my question is, how soft is this? Because I feel like, yes, we can go towards the ephemeral, the immaterial, and I think Sara touched upon that a little bit. We remain trapped in the geographic, even when we are in the immaterial and in the ephemeral space. And so I go back to the selfish part of the question. Did you think about how these different bordering practices can be visualized? Not as you try to do through a kind of a visual art practice, which of course is an expression of much more than what a border could look like. But I wonder if you ask yourself, this is really the end of it. I wondered if you ask yourself that very simple question. Given all of this, can we begin to think about how different borders could look like, how they could be visualized, perhaps even beyond the geographic? Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed. Many ideas there. Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, I just want to also mention something that that you also highlighted, that sometimes by mapping, by making visible, my fear was in this book, and I tried to reflect on it, or it was kind of ongoing while doing it, how much I am just confirming yet another time, another sectarian narrative. And that was really tricky. And it took me a while, but in the epilogue of the book, I become very honest about it, and I ask this question. And that's why I ended my presentation showing a very simple map of Tariq Jdida and Mazra'a without division, because it's a form of representation. And I decided to start the presentation dividing them, and I decided to end it combining them, just to talk about these very simple tools of representation, how you can divide and connect to, and how much through mapping and making things visible, sometimes we confirm things, not necessarily, or yeah, we kind of give them perhaps lots of value, or kind of affirmation in a way. And I think this is also what you were at the beginning talking about in your practice as someone who's involved in mapping. And it was always part of my thinking. But also there is something really interesting about philosopher, I think Etienne Balibar, where I really enjoy his he has a very small, nice essay about borders, where he talks about the impossibility of a world without borders. Because any line that you put, the way I understand it, any line, once we put anything on the paper, this is a form of boundary that you create between two sides. So I think it's become also about how we relate to certain boundaries and what is the nature of these boundaries. Architecture at the end is all about borders, but these are spaces, could create spaces of intimacy, spaces of collectiveness, spaces of participation. So I think it's a matter of the nature of these products that we do, where they sit, what are the intention behind, and that's why maybe it's really so important also to project on their possibilities, because they are so powerful, so political always, in terms of artifacts, in terms of lines, in terms of so I find his contribution helpful to think actually differently, that perhaps, yeah, we cannot escape physicality even, and this is not a bad thing. It becomes about how we can assess what we do. Who are they for? What are they for? These things that we produce, whether it's a wall, it's a fence, it's a drawing, it's a map. So the other thing about the broadcast, I never thought of it, but I found it it was one of these moments at the beginning of the research. The woman at her shop and the TV made me think of this immateriality on another level, another layer of bordering and of control. Controlling someone what to watch, what not to watch. And I thought, back then I thought it's fascinating, but I left it there. It wasn't picked up as one of the projects that I will be working on. Yeah, did I reply to? So how do we visualize? I'm at the moment, although all my work so far in this project is really about the everyday life, about tactics, from the side of residents. Currently, I'm trying to bridge, and because I'm thinking of the value of also understanding, policies and what kind of shape the experience of many people. So I'm trying now to work at two different scales and trying to create kind of a dialogue between them. But this is also to help me at this age to have a better understanding to the politics that that shape our lives. Here, for example, for me in the UK, so I'm referring to different forms of visualization and mapping, things that are slightly more conventional, like drawing locations where they are, mapping locations and headlines, and trying to work on another level with the participants about their experiences. And I still don't know the answer. But to answer you, I think we shouldn't be afraid of representation, perhaps. Because anyway, whatever we will do, you're bringing something to, it will take a position. It will have a position always. It's about, the intention behind. What is it for? Who is it for? What is it for? What role it can play? And being aware of that. Did I reply? I don't know.
I think so. That was great. Thank you so much, Mohamad. I wanted to throw a provocation about whether we can remove the term conflict and think of it as forms of inhabitants, Yeah. There is not enough time. Unfortunately, I'm very conscious of time. I know that some of our participants are just starting the day, not finishing it, like me in Beirut. So I don't want to overextend it, but I really want to express my infinite gratitude to first you and the fantastic work that we saw in the book, and to make a resolution to reread the book, thinking about it as a way of cohabitance or inhabiting space in a different way, perhaps as a form of hope, actually, outside of conflict, or maybe with conflict being part of that inhabitance, but perhaps not the only form. So I'm promising myself that this is part of my book reading. I hope that many others will as well. I really, really want to thank Ghenwa, Tania, and Sara for incredible generosity, interesting, alive, engaging comments that really brought new light to a work that I already had infinite admiration to. I didn't think I could rethink it so many times and in so many ways. So really, a lot of thanks to you guys. I also forgot to thank in the beginning everyone at the Beirut Urban Lab who managed to attend, who helped in making this event. Zaina, who unfortunately just left us because she said she will attend until her laptop battery dies. So it just died. So she didn't get to hear her thank you. It's just a matter of 2 minutes. Ahmed for the design of the poster, and then everyone else for the continuous support. I want to thank the students of the MUPP MUD program who are here, and I see you, and it's always great to see you guys here, former and current students, and then of course colleagues and friends from all over. We look forward to another event in the lab. Ghenwa, Tania, and Sara would love to have your work be discussed here. So we'll reach out and hopefully have more of you as well in the lab. Thank you, everyone. Hope you have a great day, a lovely evening, and more soon.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Mabruk.
Thank you, Tania, Sara.
Thank you so much. It was
Thank
so
you.
great.
Bye.